I remember the exact moment my world shifted. It was just past noon when my phone rang, and the hospital's calm, clipped voice carried through the line. "Ma'am, your son is here," they said. I froze. My son? Here? I hadn't seen him in months, not even a call, just the hollow echo of silence that had grown heavier with each passing week. He's here for you? I managed, voice trembling, trying to steady myself. There was a pause, just long enough for my mind to run wild. Then they added, "It's urgent. You should come immediately." I clutched the receiver, heart hammering. Urgent, my son. For me. The words collided inside me, confusing and sharp. The last time I had heard from him was a text I could barely read without tears. "I can't do this anymore." Those words had pierced deeper than any knife. He had refused to visit me for months, and every holiday, every birthday, every quiet evening in my empty apartment felt like an echo of that rejection. I remember the day it all started. Or rather, the day he stopped coming. I had been lying in bed, the weight of my body pressing down, and I saw a message on my phone. "Not coming. Sorry." That was it. Nothing more. No explanation. Just absence wrapped in a few cold words. And I had spent months replaying every memory, every argument, every tiny detail, searching for where I had gone wrong. Now, with the hospital calling, I felt a mix of panic and hope swirling inside me like a storm. I tried to call him back, but the line went straight to voicemail. "Please, Mom. I'll come when I can," I whispered into the empty line, the room suddenly feeling suffocating. The thought of seeing him again after all this time brought a torrent of emotions. I wasn't ready for anger, fear, hope, and an aching longing that refused to be quieted. By the time I reached the hospital, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my bag. The elevator ride felt endless. Each ding of the floor number made my stomach twist tighter. When the doors finally opened, I saw him standing in the hallway, looking smaller than I remembered. There was a stiffness in his posture, the kind that comes from months of avoidance. And yet, there was something else too. A shadow of fear, or maybe guilt, in his eyes. I swallowed hard and walked toward him, each step heavier than the last. "Hi," I said, my voice catching halfway. My throat felt raw, unused to speaking these words in months. He didn't respond at first. He just looked at me, his gaze flickering, hesitant, as if he wasn't sure if I was real or if this was some cruel trick. Then, the nurse appeared, breaking the tension with a brief explanation. "We weren't sure if we should call you directly," she said. "He came in this morning, very worried, and insisted you be informed. Your son, he's been diagnosed with a condition that requires immediate treatment." The words hit me like a freight train. My stomach sank, my chest tightened. A million questions raced through my mind, but the first one that forced itself out of my mouth was simple, trembling. "Is he okay?" "Yes," the nurse said, "for now. But he insisted you be here. He said he couldn't face this alone." My son looked away, swallowing hard, and I noticed the tension in his shoulders. For the first time in months, he seemed vulnerable, human, and painfully aware of the distance that had grown between us. I wanted to rush to him, to pull him into my arms and erase the months of silence, but I also hesitated. There was too much hurt, too much unspoken. I wanted to ask why he had shut me out, but the urgency of the moment made me hold my tongue. We walked together toward the consultation room. He stayed close, but not too close, a careful distance that spoke of months of avoidance and walls built too high to see over. The air was thick with unspoken words. I could feel the history between us pressing down every harsh word, every disappointment, every moment he had refused to visit me. And yet, in that pressure, there was also a fragile thread of hope. Inside the room, the doctor greeted us and explained the situation in clinical terms: treatment plans, medications, tests. But the details blurred in my mind, overshadowed by the simple fact that my son had chosen to come for me. Despite everything, despite the months of silence, despite my fear that our bond might be irreparably broken, he had arrived. I looked at him then, really looked, and for the first time in months, I saw the boy who had once clung to my hand, the young man who had confided in me and trusted me. The hurt was still there, heavy and real, but beneath it, a flicker of connection remained. I didn't know what the future held, didn't know if the walls between us could ever fully come down. But at that moment, seeing him stand there, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: relief, and yet, As relief washed over me, a deep ache followed. There were so many questions I didn't have answers to. Why had he stopped coming? Why had he pushed me away so coldly? What had he been hiding or avoiding that led him to distance himself for so long? My heart raced, knowing that whatever answers awaited, this hospital visit was only the beginning. Something larger, more complicated, was unfolding, and I could feel it pressing closer with each passing second. He finally spoke, his voice low, almost shy. "Mom, I didn't know how to." He trailed off, the words catching in his throat. The sight of him struggling to speak broke something open inside me. Months of pain, months of silence, all funneled into this small tentative confession. I reached out, placing a hand lightly on his arm, unsure if it would be accepted or rejected. "You're here now," I whispered. "That's what matters." His eyes met mine, and for the briefest moment, the walls seemed to crack. Fear, regret, longing all tangled together in a fragile, delicate knot that neither of us knew how to untangle. But at least, for the first time in months, we were standing together, facing it. The nurse cleared her throat, breaking the fragile tension. "We should start the treatment soon," she said, her voice practical, devoid of emotion. And suddenly, the weight of reality pressed down. This wasn't just a visit. This wasn't just a reunion. This was urgent, and it demanded that we move forward. Together. As we followed her to the treatment room, I could feel my son's hand brush mine, almost accidentally, almost unconsciously. And in that fleeting touch, a flood of emotions surged through me: relief, fear, anger, hope, and an overwhelming love I hadn't realized had grown even stronger through the months of silence. I knew then that whatever lay ahead, we would have to face it together. But the questions of why he had stayed away, the months lost, were still there, gnawing quietly at the edges of my mind. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself as we entered the room. The sterile smell of antiseptic, the quiet hum of machines, the beeping monitors, it all felt surreal. And yet, amid the clinical environment, the one thing that felt painfully real was the fragile bridge we were beginning to rebuild between us. The hospital visit had opened a door I didn't know was still there. And as I sat beside him, watching him navigate fear and vulnerability, I realized that this was the moment everything could change. Not with grand gestures or loud apologies, but with quiet presence, patient understanding, and a willingness to face the truth together. I didn't know if he would forgive me for my own mistakes, or if I could forgive him for his absence. I didn't know if the months of silence had left permanent scars. But for now, in this moment, all that mattered was that he was here, and that he had finally chosen to come. The days before that hospital visit had been quiet, almost painfully so. I lived in a small apartment filled with echoes of our life together, but he had been absent from it for so long that the walls themselves seemed to mourn. Every morning, I woke to the same routine: coffee, the newspaper, a walk around the block, and every evening, I returned to the same emptiness, the silence pressing down heavier with each passing hour. I had tried to reach him countless times, sending texts, leaving voicemails, even mailing letters, but they all went unanswered. He didn't block me, he just didn't respond. That made the silence feel deliberate, like a wall built carefully and deliberately between us. I spent those months replaying everything I could remember. His childhood had not been perfect. I had worked hard, sometimes too hard, to keep our family afloat. There were nights I came home exhausted, eyes burning from too little sleep, only to find him waiting for me with questions I didn't always have the energy to answer. I had sacrificed so much to give him the life I thought he deserved, and somewhere along the way, I had begun to wonder if those sacrifices had mattered. I remembered the early mornings, waking before the sun to make breakfast, pack lunches, and dress him for school. I remembered the nights I sat by his bedside, reading stories until his eyes grew heavy, whispering goodnight and brushing hair from his forehead. I remembered the years I stayed up late helping with homework, encouraging him when he felt discouraged, holding him when he fell, or when a friend's harsh words cut too deeply. I remembered the pride swelling in me when he learned to ride his bike, when he graduated from school, when he took his first job. And yet, despite all those years of giving, of showing up, of loving in ways that I hoped he would one day understand, he had turned away. His refusal to visit me wasn't just absence, it was a silent judgment, a rejection that I carried with me in every quiet moment. I wondered constantly where it had gone wrong. Had I been too strict, too tired, too absent in some invisible way? Or had he simply decided that I wasn't worth the effort anymore? Our family dynamics had never been simple. I had raised him mostly alone after my husband left, when he was very young. I worked long hours, sometimes taking multiple jobs just to make ends meet. And in the process, I had leaned on him more than I realized. I had confided in him, shared my fears and dreams, and sometimes expected him to carry burdens no child should have to bear. Perhaps that was part of why he distanced himself. He needed freedom, space, a life that didn't carry the weight of my worries. Still, I never imagined he would abandon me entirely. I called my friends and family, hoping someone could explain, someone who might know what had happened to create such a rift. But no one had answers. They all shrugged, offering platitudes. I didn't want. Teenagers grow distant. Young adults need space. Give him time. And so I waited. I lived each day in a careful balance of hope and dread, preparing myself for the call that might never come. During those months, I also began to notice how much I had relied on his presence, not just physically, but emotionally. His absence left a gap that nothing could fill. Meals felt lonely. Television shows went unwatched. Even the mail seemed heavier, carrying reminders of what could have been. Birthday cards he didn't send, invitations he ignored, notes from school or work I tucked away without reading. I had never felt more invisible, yet more aware of my own endurance. I learned to carry my loneliness quietly, to smile when neighbors asked how I was, to nod politely when someone commented on my apartment, pretending that all was well. I also thought a lot about the sacrifices I had made over the years. I had given up promotions that required travel so I could be home for him. I had postponed my own dreams, my own ambitions, to make sure he had stability, care, and love. And now, all of that seemed like it had been taken for granted, ignored, or rejected. The bitterness rose in me occasionally, sharp and unwelcome, but I tried to quell it with deep breaths and the mantra that he was still my son, and that he had once loved me deeply. That memory became my anchor. Fragile as it was, even simple daily life became a lesson in endurance. I would wake in the morning, preparing breakfast for one, always thinking of how he used to eat beside me. I walked the same streets we had walked together, noting how much they had changed or maybe how much I had changed. Grocery, shopping, paying bills, cleaning the apartment, tending to myself, it was all routine, but each action reminded me of what had been lost. And in the quiet of the night, when I sat alone with a cup of tea and the soft hum of the city outside my window, I often cried, not loud, not dramatic, but quietly. Like a whispered acknowledgement of my pain, there were small sparks of hope too that kept me going. Occasionally, I would see him on social media, pictures of him with friends, traveling, laughing, everything I longed to be part of. And I felt a mixture of pride and sadness. Pride that he was living, even if I wasn't part of his joy, and sadness that I had become a stranger in my own son's life. Through it all, I clung to the belief that one day, he might come back. That belief became a quiet rhythm in my life, a steady pulse that carried me through each lonely morning and sleepless night. I imagined conversations we might have, apologies exchanged, laughter, returning to our home. I imagined rebuilding what had been broken piece by piece, if only he would step through the door. And then came the day the hospital called, breaking through months of silence. The urgency in their voice shattered the fragile calm I had maintained. He was here, and the boy who had refused to visit was standing in front of me, vulnerable and human, needing me in ways I hadn't expected. The weight of months, of years of absence and silence, crashed down on me, but amid that weight, a flicker of something stronger emerged. Love, stubborn and unyielding, refused to be extinguished. I realized then that our story was far from over. The past months, filled with daily struggles, sacrifices, and quiet endurance, had prepared me for this moment. And as I sat beside him in the hospital room, watching the uncertainty in his eyes, I knew that understanding, patience, and a willingness to face what had been avoided for so long would be the only way forward. This was not just about treatment, about health, or even the physical presence in the room. It was about rebuilding trust, confronting mistakes, and navigating the delicate terrain of a relationship strained to its limits. The journey ahead would be long, uncertain, and filled with challenges neither of us fully understood yet. But for the first time in months, I felt that faint, almost imperceptible shift, a sense that maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. And as I watched him fidget with the edge of the hospital blanket, Avoiding my gaze, I knew that the days ahead would test every ounce of patience and resilience I had built over the years, but they would also offer the possibility of reconciliation, of growth, and perhaps of a love redefined not perfect, but real, human, and enduring. I reached out again, lightly, hesitantly, and he didn't pull away. That small act, almost accidental, almost unconscious, told me that despite the distance, despite the months of rejection, the connection had not been lost entirely. And in that moment, I realized that while the past could not be erased, the future, however uncertain, still held a fragile promise. Type, continue part 3, continue part 3. The tension in the days that followed was almost unbearable. My son remained at the hospital, sitting beside me with a quiet presence that spoke volumes, yet said almost nothing. Every time I tried to start a conversation, his answers were clipped, brief, and cautious, as if words themselves carried the weight of months of unspoken resentment. And I understood he had walls now, tall and immovable, built over years of distance and disappointment, and I was staring at them, unsure how to scale them without hurting him or myself. He would occasionally glance at me, and in those fleeting moments, I saw glimpses of the boy I had known, the way his eyes lit up when he found something funny, the subtle tilt of his head when he was thinking, the slight frown when something felt unfair. But then, just as quickly, he would retreat into himself, shutting the door to the emotions I longed to access. I tried not to take it personally, telling myself that fear and guilt often masqueraded as silence, and that my role now was to be patient, present, and steady. The hospital routine became our new reality. Each morning, we met the nurses, followed the doctor's instructions, administered medications, and monitored vital signs. But beyond the practicalities, there was an invisible tension, a push and pull that neither of us could navigate easily. Every time I reached out to him literally or emotionally, he flinched, and every time he initiated contact, I felt a flicker of hope tempered by uncertainty. I realized that he was struggling with more than just his health. He carried months of avoidance, guilt, and perhaps even shame for the distance he had created. He was a grown man, but I could see the child inside him, the child who had once sought comfort in my arms, who had once clung to me in fear or sorrow, who had trusted me completely. That child was still there, buried beneath layers of pride, anger, and fear, and I needed to reach him without breaking the fragile barrier he had constructed. He started to confide in small ways. A question here, a comment there, always carefully measured. I could sense the inner conflict. He wanted connection, but he feared vulnerability. He wanted to express concern, but he feared exposing weakness. Each tiny interaction was a test, a dance of trust that could be broken by a single misstep. I had to be careful, deliberate, and endlessly patient, allowing him space while showing him that I remained steadfast. At night, when the hospital quieted and the fluorescent lights dimmed, we would sit together, sometimes in silence, sometimes talking about mundane things, the weather, a show he had watched, a story from my past. These moments, seemingly trivial, became the scaffolding of our fragile reconciliation. I realized that rebuilding trust was not about grand gestures or forceful conversations. It was about showing up consistently, without judgment, and allowing him to return in his own time. Yet the emotional pressure was immense. I felt it in every corner of the hospital room, in every glance he avoided, in every pause before he spoke. The silence itself became a presence, heavy and suffocating, reminding me of all the months lost, all the words left unsaid, all the moments of absence that could not be reclaimed. My heart ached for him, for myself, for the life that had been interrupted by his refusal to visit, and I often found myself on the edge of tears, holding them back so I could remain the steady presence he needed. There were moments of subtle manipulation, too not malicious, not overt, but enough to remind me that he was testing the boundaries. Sometimes he would withhold information about his discomfort or symptoms, as if seeing how I would react, gauging whether I would push, prod, or panic. Other times, he would make half-hearted promises about future visits or conversations, only to retract them quietly, leaving me balancing hope and disappointment once again. It was exhausting, emotionally draining, and yet, I could not give up. The power imbalance between us was palpable. I was the caregiver, the one with experience, knowledge, and patience, while he was the one in need, dependent, yet fiercely protective of his own autonomy. Every interaction required careful navigation: how much to say, how much to guide, how much to let him lead. One wrong word, one impatient sigh, and the fragile thread connecting us could snap. And I understood this better than anyone. Rebuilding trust with someone who had distanced themselves for months required gentleness, consistency, and unwavering presence. Internal conflict raged within me. On one hand, I was relieved and grateful that he had come, that he was here, that he had chosen to involve me in this critical moment. On the other hand, I was hurt, wounded by months of absence, by the deliberate silence that had made me feel invisible. I wrestled with anger, guilt, love, and fear simultaneously, each emotion battling for dominance, each threatening to overwhelm my carefully maintained calm. I found solace in small observations. How he flinched at loud noises, how he pressed a hand to his forehead when thinking, how he sometimes smiled at things I didn't expect. Each small sign was a reminder that he was still human, still the person I had raised, still capable of connection. And yet, these small signs were interspersed with sudden withdrawals. Moments of coldness, reminders of the distance he had erected over time. Friends and family offered advice, but their words often felt empty. Just give him space, they would say, he'll come around. But space was already the default. The issue was not merely distance, but the emotional walls he had built. I needed more than patience. I needed understanding, empathy, and the ability to hold my own feelings in check while navigating his complexities. Each evening, as I prepared for the night, I would watch him settle into the hospital bed, reading or scrolling on his phone, pretending to be occupied. I would reflect on the months of absence, the holidays celebrated alone, the birthdays marked with empty chairs, the silent apartment that had become my constant companion. And yet, I also reflected on this fragile presence beside me now, this tentative reconnection that felt like walking on ice over a deep, dark lake. One wrong step could plunge us both into despair, but careful navigation might bring us safely to shore. He started opening up slowly, first about practical things: his treatment, his fears, his discomfort. Then eventually, about emotions he hadn't voiced in months. Guilt, fear, sadness, loneliness, all the feelings that had driven his avoidance began to surface, and I listened, letting him speak without interruption, without judgment. Each confession, no matter how small, chipped away at the walls, revealing glimpses of vulnerability I had longed to see. There were nights when I cried silently after he slept, mourning the months lost, the distance maintained, the opportunities missed. Yet, in the same moments, I also felt gratitude that he was alive, that he was here, that he had trusted me enough to return, however cautiously. The duality of pain and relief became a constant companion, a rhythm we both unknowingly danced to each day. In the hospital, among the beeping machines and antiseptic smells, our relationship transformed. It was no longer defined by absence or silence, but by presence, however tentative. We were learning to navigate emotional pressure together, balancing vulnerability with caution, fear with hope. Every small act, holding his hand briefly, sharing a meal, exchanging a word of comfort, became a building block in reconstructing trust that had been eroded over months of avoidance. I realized that control was an illusion. I could not force him to open up, could not demand his affection, could not undo the months of absence. All I could do was be present, steady, patient, and loving, offering a safe space where he could choose to engage on his own terms. And in that, there was power, a quiet, persistent power rooted not in authority, but in unwavering presence and commitment. Internal conflict remained, simmering beneath the surface. My love for him was constant, yet my hurt was undeniable. My desire to forgive clashed with the sting of rejection. My hope for reconciliation battled the fear of further disappointment. Every interaction required emotional acuity, careful attention to nuance, and an endless well of patience. And yet, I endured, because I knew that this was the only path forward, the only way to rebuild what had been fractured. I watched him one evening as he gazed out the window, the city lights reflecting in his eyes. He seemed lost in thought, distant, yet present, and I felt the weight of our history pressing down, reminding me of every sacrifice, every hardship, every moment I had invested in him. And yet, in that quiet observation, I also felt the stirring of hope. Fragile but undeniable, the emotional pressure, the subtle manipulation, the power imbalance, all of it became part of our reality, shaping how we interacted, how we communicated, how we rebuilt trust. And through it all, I discovered a new strength within myself, the ability to love unconditionally, to endure quietly, to navigate complexity without losing my own sense of self. As the days passed, small victories emerged. A smile lingered a little longer. A conversation flowed a little more freely. A touch was held without flinching. And though the tension never fully disappeared, the ice beneath our feet began to feel more solid, more navigable. We were learning together to reclaim what had been lost, not through force, but through patience, understanding, and the quiet persistence of love. And yet, even as progress unfolded, I sensed that something remained hidden, something unspoken that continued to influence his distance and hesitation. The truth, I suspected, was waiting, lurking beneath layers of fear and avoidance, ready to surface at a moment neither of us fully anticipated. And when it did, I knew that our fragile equilibrium would be tested in ways we could not yet imagine. The moment of revelation came quietly, almost innocuously, yet it carried a weight that would forever change the rhythm of our fragile connection. It was late afternoon, the hospital corridors bathed in that soft, orange glow that filtered through the blinds. I was reviewing some paperwork from the doctor forms, test results, medication schedules when I noticed a folder that had been left on the counter. It was labeled with his name, and curiosity, mixed with a subtle dread, pulled me toward it. I opened the folder slowly, careful not to make a sound, and the papers inside immediately made my heart tighten. There were reports, notes, and letters, each stamped with dates and medical notations. I barely understood, but what caught my eye was a small, folded piece of paper tucked at the very bottom. It wasn't a medical note, it was a personal letter, and it was addressed to me. As I unfolded it, my hands shook slightly. The handwriting was unmistakable, my son's, precise but slightly hesitant, as if he had struggled to put these words to paper. I read the first line. Mom, I didn't know how to tell you. I've been afraid. Afraid of disappointing you, afraid of facing my own mistakes, and afraid of losing you. My throat tightened. Every word he had avoided saying in person, every silence, every refusal to visit, was distilled into this simple confession. I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes, and for the first time in months, the tension that had defined our interactions began to ease. But the letter wasn't finished. It went on to explain why he had stayed away: financial struggles, fear of judgment, pressure from his own life, and a series of decisions he had made that he couldn't face me about. He admitted that he had felt ashamed, embarrassed, and overwhelmed. He had thought that by distancing himself, he was protecting both of us from disappointment, from confrontation, from the awkwardness of adult mistakes laid bare. And now, he wrote, he realized that his absence had caused more harm than his presence ever could. I should have come sooner. I should have told you sooner. I'm sorry for making you wait, for leaving you alone, for every day that felt like rejection. I can't undo it, but I hope this is a start. Reading those words, I felt a rush of emotions: relief, sorrow, love, and an almost crushing weight of the months lost. But amid the flood of feelings, a quiet clarity emerged. The pain, the silence, the avoidance, all of it had been fueled not by malice or indifference, but by fear, pride, and human vulnerability. The distance had been built on misunderstanding, not hatred, and the revelation of his inner struggle shifted the balance between us in ways I hadn't dared hope for. I looked up and saw him sitting nearby, his gaze fixed on the floor. I realized then that he hadn't given the letter to me in person because he was still vulnerable, still afraid of seeing my reaction directly. Yet, the act itself, the courage to write, to expose himself in ink, was more than words could convey. It was a bridge extended, a hand reaching through months of silence, fragile but steadfast. I called him over gently. I read your letter, I said, voice soft, catching on the first words. He looked at me, apprehension flickering in his eyes, as if he weren't sure whether to hope or fear. Thank you, I whispered, for telling me, for being honest. He swallowed hard, and for the first time, I saw tears in his eyes, subtle but undeniable. I didn't know how, he admitted, voice trembling. I thought you'd be angry, that you'd hate me for not coming sooner. I could never hate you, I said, reaching for his hand. He hesitated, then let me take it, and the connection felt like a small, quiet triumph, a crack in the walls that had kept us apart. I've been hurt, yes, I admitted. I've been lonely, but knowing the truth, understanding why, It changes everything. That afternoon, we spoke for hours. Slowly, carefully, he shared the details he had withheld, the financial problems he had been struggling with, the personal mistakes he had feared admitting, the guilt that had made every visit feel impossible. And I listened, not judging, not correcting, not rushing, just listening. Each confession he offered peeled away a layer of tension, a layer of fear, a layer of the control he had exercised through absence. It became clear that his silence had been a coping mechanism, a way to navigate his own inner chaos. And in recognizing this, I felt a profound shift. The imbalance of power, once palpable, began to dissolve. He no longer held control through absence. He was returning cautiously, but deliberately. And the responsibility of connection was now shared. We reviewed documents together, the hospital records, insurance forms, test results, and I saw his anxiety ease as he realized he wasn't alone. Each decision, each step of treatment, became a collaboration rather than a source of tension. And as the evening sun filtered through the hospital blinds, casting long shadows across the room, I felt a sense of relief I hadn't known in months. In that quiet revelation, I also discovered something about myself. I realized that my patience, endurance, and unwavering presence had created a space where he could finally reveal the truth. I hadn't forced him, hadn't scolded, hadn't pressured, just waited, watched, and loved. And that love, steady and calm, had been enough to guide him back to honesty. The next days were a continuation of this new dynamic. Our conversations became more open, more sincere. He asked questions about his treatment, shared worries, admitted fears, and slowly, cautiously, allowed himself to be comforted. I, in turn, shared my perspective not with anger or accusation, but with honesty and calm, acknowledging the hurt without letting it dominate. One afternoon, as we sat quietly after a routine checkup, he turned to me and said, "I never realized. I never knew how much my absence hurt you." "I know," I replied softly, "but now you do. And that matters more than anything." And in that moment, the turning point felt complete, not because all pain was erased, not because the past months disappeared, but because truth had been revealed, walls had been cracked, and the path forward had become visible. We were no longer trapped in silence or misunderstanding. The revelation had shifted the balance, transforming fear and avoidance into connection and honesty. It was quiet justice, subtle and unspoken. He had come to me when it mattered most, and I had met him with patience, understanding, and love. The months of tension, avoidance, and control had led us to this pivotal moment where both of us could finally begin to rebuild. Not hurriedly, not forcefully, but deliberately, with care and respect for the emotional scars we carried. The hospital room, once a place of uncertainty and quiet dread, now felt like a space of fragile hope. Machines still hummed, monitors still beeped, and tests still awaited, but beneath the clinical noise, a deeper rhythm had emerged, the rhythm of connection, honesty, and reconciliation. And as I watched him relax slightly, allowing himself to be present, I knew that the true turning point had arrived. The revelation of truth had freed us from the past, illuminated the path forward, and allowed love, in its quiet, resilient way, to reclaim its place between us. The days after the revelation carried a quiet, almost fragile peace. The hospital visits, once filled with tension and uncertainty, now felt calmer. My son moved with a little more ease, asking questions without hesitation, sharing concerns without fear of judgment, and even allowing himself brief moments of vulnerability that previously would have been impossible. And I, in turn, learned to respond not with impatience or anxiety, but with gentle guidance and unwavering presence. It was not a dramatic turnaround. There were no grand gestures, no sudden declarations of love or forgiveness. Instead, there was quiet acknowledgement, small acts of care, and the subtle rebuilding of trust. I made his favorite meals when he stayed over, carefully following the dietary guidelines the doctors recommended. And he began to participate in simple routines with me, helping where he could, sharing thoughts that had previously been hidden behind walls of pride or fear. Each day, these small, ordinary moments began to stitch together the fabric of our relationship. Slowly, deliberately, and carefully. One evening, as I helped him settle into the hospital bed after a long day of tests, he reached out and took my hand without hesitation. "Thank you for being here," he said softly, the words almost lost in the quiet hum of the machines. I squeezed his hand gently, letting him know without words that his presence, his honesty, and even his past absences were all part of the path that had led us here. We began to talk about the future, not in grand terms, not with lofty promises, but simply plans for after the treatment, steps to ensure he could manage his health, ways to stay connected even after he returned to his apartment. These conversations, calm and practical, became the foundation for a renewed bond. They were infused with care, responsibility, and a quiet understanding that love sometimes meant waiting, sometimes meant patience, and sometimes meant simply showing up. Day after day. In the following weeks, I noticed subtle changes in both of us. He smiled more easily, laughed at small jokes, and even initiated conversations about things that had once been forbidden territory, our past arguments, the months of silence, and the misunderstandings that had kept us apart. And while there were still moments of awkwardness, moments when the scars of absence and rejection surfaced, they no longer dominated our interactions. Instead, they became reminders of resilience, growth, and the strength of a bond that had endured trials without breaking. One quiet afternoon, as I watched him rest after a routine procedure, I reflected on everything that had led us here. The months of waiting, the fear and uncertainty, the subtle manipulations and withheld words, they had all been part of a journey that neither of us fully understood at the time. But now, looking at him, seeing the tentative peace in his expression, I understood something profound. Love and connection were not about perfection, nor were they about grand gestures. They were about endurance, patience, understanding, and the willingness to remain present even when it was hardest. We began to plan small routines for when he returned home. Shared meals, regular check-ins, and quiet evenings together became symbols not of obligation but of choice, the conscious decision to remain connected, to honor the bond that had been tested and proven resilient. And in those simple routines, the quiet justice of our reconciliation unfolded. He had come when it mattered most, and I had met him with steady love, allowing trust to grow naturally rather than forcing it prematurely. There were still challenges, of course. Healing was ongoing, both emotionally and physically. Some days he would retreat into silence, and some days I would struggle with the echoes of the past. But those moments were no longer permanent states, they were pauses, brief interludes in a longer narrative of connection, recovery, and understanding. We had learned to navigate them together, without fear, without resentment, and with a deepening appreciation for the fragility and strength of our relationship. And then, one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the hospital hallways were bathed in that soft, amber light, he turned to me and said simply, "I want to make things right. With you, Mom. I don't want to lose this again." I felt a swell of emotion rise within me. Not the dramatic, overwhelming kind, but the quiet, deeply rooted satisfaction of a journey completed not perfectly, but fully. I nodded, holding his hand firmly, feeling the warmth and weight of his commitment, and replied, "We'll do it together." Step by step, in the weeks that followed, our relationship continued to grow in subtle, profound ways. There were shared meals, quiet conversations, laughter that returned in small bursts, and even moments of silence that no longer felt oppressive but restorative. The hospital visits became markers of progress, not tension, and each day brought us closer to a version of connection that was honest, resilient, and deeply earned. Looking back, I realized that the months of absence, the emotional distance, and even the fear and silence had served a purpose. They had tested the endurance of our bond, revealed vulnerabilities, and forced both of us to confront fears and regrets that might otherwise have remained hidden. And in facing them, in allowing truth to surface and love to persist, we had achieved a quiet justice, a resolution not dramatized or loud, but deeply felt, lasting, and real. In the calm that followed, I understood that this was the heart of parenthood and connection, the ability to love persistently, to wait patiently, and to offer understanding even when the path is uncertain. My son and I had weathered absence, fear, and misunderstanding, and now, in the gentle rhythm of everyday life, we were learning to trust and support one another again. And as I watched him rest peacefully one evening, the faintest smile on his lips, I knew that the journey was ongoing, but that we were moving forward together quietly, steadily, and with hearts open to the fragile, enduring power of love.